Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click. Oh, is that?
That is my.
That's
my Sealyham Terrier.
That's great.
Yeah, that's Pogus.
Shows you that, and I'm not going to edit that out. So we're joined today by Christine Nicol and her noisy hound. Who is it? What's his name?
Pogus. Hang on, I'm going to have to. Pogus. Poggy, come here. Oh, there's someone's visiting. We really might have to pause for a second while
we can pause.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, we'll go again then. Here we go.
Okay.
Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click. I'm joined today by Christine Nicol and Pogus, and we'll talk about Pogus in a minute because he's already given us one full start. And if anybody comes to Christine's door during this chat, then we'll probably have to start again. But it's not every day you get to spend some time with somebody who is literally responsible for the better welfare of billions of animals. If you think that over 800 million chickens are killed in the UK each year, you think how many billions of animals lives you've made better, which is quite something. And Christine also has the notable claim to being my first co-author. The first paper I ever produced was, which was all Christine's idea. I just hasten to add, I'm not really claiming any, but as an undergraduate, she supervised my project on chickens, tonic immobility and slaughterhouses. She's supervised over 30 PhD students. Many have gone on to very senior positions in animal welfare. She's a visiting professor at Lincoln, so as well as being a proper professor at the RVC. But before that spent a number of years at Bristol, where she basically grew the group from just herself and John Webster was officially animal husbandry, wasn't he? But the animal welfare group ended up to be around about 70 people, which is bigger than my department at Lincoln. So, quite a phenomenal achievement and a real advocate for public communication of science. So the stimulus response videos that, if you listen to the one with Don Broom that I did last week, you'll have heard a little bit, and we may talk about that. And Let's Ask the Animals, which were two videos produced for schools, and we'll talk about that. But also a Radio 4 series, which I know in the UK you can still get. I don't know if you can get it if you're outside, which I think was a stroke of genius. Christine wrote the program with and had comedian Jake Yap involved as well, called Would You Eat an Alien? And it was really smart because it brings sort of the welfare issues sort of into a new context, but they're just as relevant. Christine, I know, is a very keen horse person as well. And we've actually just finished co-supervising a PhD student, so we'll probably talk a bit about horses as well. And produced hundreds of papers, thousands of citations, several books, co-authored chapters, etc. So welcome, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And
I'm not sure I recognise this person, but yeah.
Yes. Well, I can remember you arriving at Bristol, and it was actually a John Webster lecture that you appeared at the front of the lecture hall, and I think you were sitting because you just arrived and wanted to get an idea what you had let yourself in for, and so that was a few years ago.
Oh my word, that was that's absolutely going right back to 1985. I think I just started in December, and I was absolutely terrified. I was so terrified of the idea of teaching these vet students who were only maybe a year or 2 years younger than I was.
Some of them were older than you, I can tell you that.
Some of them were older than me. And I felt I knew very, very little about veterinary things generally. I honestly expected to find a letter on my desk every day when I went in saying, "We're sorry, we've made a terrible mistake. We meant to appoint someone else."
It's
And I felt like that for the first sort of 3 or 4 years, I'd say. But yeah.
I still feel like that when I go into some lectures some of the time. But I think amongst our year, because I was in the cohort 85 that started at Bristol, and yeah, people were sort of, who's that person who's joined our class? You know, is that a late starter or something who's joined the main course? No, that's the new lecturer in animal. And you were a lecturer in animal welfare. And yeah, Don pointed out, you know, he got his chair in 86, and that was the first professorship.
Yeah.
And it was interesting chatting to him, because he was saying sort of, well, people didn't want to use the word animal welfare in an academic setting. So I'm just wondering, was that the first lectureship in animal welfare?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think that was John Webster's idea, that he applied specifically for funds for a lectureship in animal welfare. It was actually called it sounds horrible, but it was called a new blood lectureship. The idea was to get some young person in. But yeah, the animal welfare theme was his idea. I wasn't the first person who was offered that job. I was going to, you know, if this is going to be a historical record, I think that the job was offered, I think it was offered initially to Mike Baxter, who was working in sort of like engineering and animal design of animal housing.
Okay.
But I think he turned it down, and they re-advertised. I think it was then offered to Alistair Lawrence, who also turned it down because I think in the end decided he didn't want to leave Scotland. Right. So I was sort of pretty down on the list, and I think they must have been a bit sort of, oh my goodness, we've only got one other candidate left. But
well, it ended up a hell of an appointment, I think. And you see what that must have been at its peak the biggest group in the world, the animal welfare group at Bristol. Yeah, I mean, Alistair
it really
has
grew. Yeah, he's got a great group in Scotland, but yeah, no, Bristol, it really grew through a combination of things. Obviously, the sort of areas of work that I was interested in, we were able to get some funding and build that. But 2 other things happened. One was that there was a meat research institute already at Bristol, which was not part of the university. And then that joined the university, or a lot of people, unfortunately, you know, lost their jobs in the Meat Research Institute. But the people who were working on stunning and slaughter, they became part of the university, and they were retained. So they then integrated into the welfare group, doing a very different type of animal welfare, you know, really the real sharp end, you know, working in abattoirs, working with transportation systems. But people like Steve Keston and Steve Brown and Paul Warris, Toby Knowles, Claire Weeks, a lot of these people then were able to sort of join from that side. And the other thing that happened was that John Bradshaw wanted to relocate his group from Southampton. So we had some companion animal people came, and then we had a lot of visitors, because if you become a big group, you become hopefully attractive to other people. So we had visitors and people from all over Europe. And it was just, I thought it was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. You know, the 1990s at Bristol was just perfect.
When I left, 1990 was when I left. I was only a student, but well, you could see by the time, I graduated in 1990, you could see where it was going. And it's interesting doing these chats with people, because, as you say, I'm sure it's down largely to your brilliance, but also a bit of luck, you know. And it's those, you know,
it's those things. It's very much. It's not. I mean, another thing that I have to mention is that another lectureship became available in the department, and it could have been a dermatologist, it could have been any veterinary position. And I argued at that point that the welfare group was doing incredibly well, and therefore what we needed was another welfare lecturer. And I remember arguing that, and everyone going, "You must be mad." And I said, no, science is changing. It's changing from being one person thin, you know, one person doing this and one person doing that. Groups are growing. Groups are important. It's a way to share ideas. And for some reason, that argument won the day. And so then we were able to appoint Mike Mendel. So that was the other really key strategic decision, because then Mike was able to develop that fundamental side, you know, animal emotion and all that work. And so we really did have a group that went from, you know, how to kill an animal to how to consider what an animal might be feeling and what emotions it might have, you know, right through to sort of statistical expertise, looking at epidemiology, working out risk factors for welfare conditions. So it spanned a huge range of topics, and by no means was it my brilliance. It was just, you know, bringing a lot of the right people together into one place. Yeah.
But it also says something, well, it's nice, you know, the management must be quite important in that as well, to share that vision. As I said, if you can persuade somebody that actually we need another animal welfare lectureship, and I don't know at what level that decision was made. I mean, I'm trying to think, was that Avril when she was head of Avril Waterman Pearson?
It was before Avril was head of department. I can't remember. I actually can't remember.
Phil Duffus
the timelines together.
Phil Duffus was,
but we had Philip Duffus.
Yeah. So that, I mean, but you know, with such a big group though, and especially something like that, because okay, you've got the vet course and that's generating its money. And I know you obviously developed the animal behavior degree down at Bristol, but comes with that an enormous responsibility. Well, I would have thought, you know, to keep those people in a job, and a lot of them will be, I guess, postdocs, and postdocing is not an easy existence.
No, it's not.
But to keep the money rolling in, to keep that group, must have been a tremendous pressure, surely.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very busy time. If I look back, it was, there were a lot of grant applications going in, a lot of fellowship applications going in. And I think a lot of, you know, I was relatively successful with some of the grants that I wrote, but I wasn't universally successful by any stretch of the imagination. I think that one of the main things that I was able to do, and I hope that people don't end up sort of listening to this and going, that's not true, was just to try to encourage other people as well. So I think that's always been something that I've really tried to do, is not to be negative, but to always try to be constructive. So if someone comes with a grant idea, even if initially you don't think it's got that much promise, it's a massive achievement to have got an idea for a grant proposal. So it's about taking what's positive and then encouraging, and not people. I think we get a huge amount of criticism in science from outside. Every time you send off a paper or a grant, you're going to get external reviewers' reports back, and they can often be quite negative, or they can focus on the negative, even if they go, this is great, but, and then list 20 things that are wrong with it. The impression can be quite a negative one. So I think in your own group, if you have a home group, I always thought of it a bit like a sort of extended family, that is not the place where you need negativity. So it's very much about sort of trying to take the ideas that people have and encourage them to develop them. So I think if I sort of did anything, it was probably trying to keep morale up and be positive, not in a stupid way, but, you know, in a genuine way. Yeah.
I think that's fair enough. And I think, so, and I think that is typical of you. I'm going to take a diversion at this point, because I know sort of as an undergraduate, you just supervised one project of mine. But I don't know, I you know, we went to slaughterhouses together. We got on all right, and we're still chatting to each other. So, but you know, there were those inspirational things. And I know Jonathan Cooper, who was one of your first PhD students, who's a lecturer at Bristol, and he had the expression that the great thing about Christine is every now and again she throws a crumb off the table, which is just a bit of brilliance, you know, that she just shares. This is not a welfare thing, but you may or may not remember this, but this is something that actually had a really big impact on me. And this was sort of early-ish internet days, and I remember sending you an email, and this was round about the time that Jamie Bulger and the kids, for those people who not from the UK, Jamie Bulger was a little toddler who was killed by some young children, and they were remarkably young, the children who killed Jamie, and he was quite so he was assaulted in the process. And there was then this campaign about these two kids who, well, they were, what were they, 8 and 10 or something?
They were 10,
yeah,
about 10
that,
years
that
old,
sort of
something
age,
like
you
that.
know, and it was quite so it caused quite a shock. And then people saying, oh, well, you know, they're going to grant them anonymity and they're going to release them back into the community. And there was one of these sort of campaigns came through, and they're saying these kids should not be released. And I thought, and I sent it to you, and you sent me a reply and said, I'm not prepared to sign this because you know nothing about those kids' backgrounds. And, you know, if we understood and whatever. And it was, and, you know, you weren't critical, but it's one of those moments I can go back to and I think, yeah, that was a moment when I stopped thinking about, judging others to the same degree. And, you know, I've had lucky breaks, and I've looked back on sort of my time, and then there think, yeah, there but for the grace of God go I. You know, that you know, I was fortunate that you know, my upbringing, that I didn't have those experiences. And it was just that, you know, you weren't critical, you just sort of made it quite clear. And as I said, for me personally, that was quite a transformative, just that one act. And it is one of those things, you know, you probably don't even remember doing it. But
I don't, to be honest. I can imagine doing it. But then I was brought up in a Quaker family, so we were brought up to not to I suppose to work out what's wrong with the world, work out what needs to be put right, but to be very careful about blaming any particular person for those things that are wrong. Doesn't mean that there's no such thing as guilt or responsibility, but it was a very strange upbringing. I don't know if you've ever been to a Quaker meeting. I don't go now, but as a child I used to go. And you sit there in silence, and then every so often somebody gets up because they've been inspired to say something that's on their mind. And my goodness, you have to think it's the opposite of going to church, where you're told something, or here's a sermon, or here's a hymn to sing. It's just all these questions. The Quakers actually have this book called Advices and Queries. And the queries are these like ethical, moral dilemmas. And there you are sitting there as an 8-year-old, and somebody stands up and says, you know, have you been adventurous enough in your life in this last week? And what happens if you're not adventurous enough? And you're sitting there. So, you know, it's a strange upbringing, but my goodness, it makes you think very deeply about things. Well, it's a mixed blessing, I think, but yeah.
I was brought up as a Catholic, and very much with the guilt complex. And you know, the school that I went to, especially the secondary school, was very much macho males, and when you're 5'6" and can't play rugby, it doesn't do you very well. No. But I mean, I think, give you an idea, the sort of stupid thing that used to go on. I mean, they always used to send a bus that was too small for everybody. And, you know, if you were in the senior years, you got to sit at the back of the bus and you got your own seat. And there was this hierarchy. If you were in the lower years, you sat right at the front, and it transitioned down. And there were sort of transition points, and you weren't allowed to go beyond, you know, halfway down the bus if you were in the early years. Well, you know, people would fight to get a seat. And I just sort of thought, this is ridiculous, you know, and I'd rather be on the edge of a seat when there was like 2 seats. You know, you wouldn't be legally allowed to do, you probably weren't legally allowed to do it then either. But, you know, you'd be sitting 3 a row, and there'd be spare seats at the back. And I just thought, you know, rather than fight for a seat and end up sitting 3 a seat, I'm just going to wait and let everybody on, and then I'll wander on and I'll go and sit on a spare seat. And people would sort of look at me and say, what are you doing? I said, well, there's a spare seat here, you know. I'm just you know, didn't have the brawn, so I tried to use the brain to try and solve that one. But it was
you took a different path. A step back and think about it path.
But it was brutal, you know. I mean, teachers would constantly throw board rubbers at you, you know, and hit you and whatever. With one teacher who his punishment was he'd get chalk and scribble all over the whiteboard and strap your hand with one finger, and you had to clean the board with your finger, and it'd be bleeding by the end of it. You know, that was
Yeah,
my
yeah.
upbringing. It wasn't quite so thoughtful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was my Sunday upbringing. I mean, during the week, you know, I went to a junior school where the boys were hit with rulers on the back of the knee if they were bad, and sort of a fairly tough secondary school as well, I have to say, comprehensive school in Cardiff that's been knocked down since I left.
So did you ever go to your
quite a tough
class
environment.
and say, I saw this at school and I want to share that thought, that dilemma?
Oh no, I never spoke at all at the Quaker meeting, but a lot of what was said to me sank in. And it was actually there that I think they fostered my innate interest in animals. I remember there were only about 5 of us that would go out into sort of like the children's class, but we had some really radical people. Quakers can be quite radical, some of them. So we had sort of like a whole lot of vegetarian teachers that would tell us about animals going into slaughterhouses and how frightened they might be. And this was when I was about 10. And I do remember going home from one of those and saying, that's it, I'm not eating meat again. And of course, my mother, who was the Quaker and had brought us up to think about things, then had to go along with it because she was, you know, she was like, oh, well, you've made a informed decision. Now what are we going to eat?
But you're about 10 when you decided that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. So
yeah.
So how did you, I mean, because you went to Oxford and did your zoology degree. Did you go to university thinking, I want to work in animal welfare, or is it something that...
Yeah, so, well, I thought I wanted to be a vet. So throughout my teenage years, I worked on Saturday mornings in a companion animal practice, which was great fun. The vet nurses were a real laugh. And but after sort of 2 or 3 years, I did realize there was an awful lot of sort of cleaning out anal glands and things like that. And I was beginning to read books by Jane Goodall. And so at the last minute, I sort of swapped my application for vet school to one for zoology. But I was more thinking about conservation. I'd done a bit of work with at Gerald Durrell's place in Jersey, and I spent my summer before I went to uni working in a wildlife park. You wouldn't be allowed now, but I used to go in with the elephant all by myself and clean out the elephant before health and safety was invented.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. So I was much more thinking about conservation. But when I had my interview to go to Oxford, and this is where you think about the phrase, there's no such thing as a coincidence, but I don't, we could explore that. But anyway, by coincidence or happenstance, or it was just the right time and the right person, the person who interviewed me to do zoology at Oxford was Marion Dawkins. I hadn't applied to that college because she was there. It just happened that she was the biology tutor. And I went to her for an interview and I gave her the benefit of my very well-formed 18-year-old opinion that I wanted to do zoology, but I was not going to do any experiments on live animals, and I wasn't very keen on doing dissections either. I think almost anyone else would have just rejected me instantly. But Marion asked me why, and we just talked about that a lot, and she accepted me. So, you know, that was amazing, really. Yeah.
That's quite something, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, so let's go through a little bit of the history anyway. So you did your PhD with Marion as well, didn't you? So
yeah.
So
in my summers, in my summers as a student, I would work for her, helping with her hen preference experiments when I was an undergraduate, which I loved doing. And then I went off to work with Martha Kiley Worthington, actually, with horses. And I still had no idea I was going to do a PhD, but for various reasons, I ended up back in Oxford, went to see Marion again, said, can I still help you with your chicken experiments? And she said, I will write to the ministry and see if they'll fund a PhD. So she wrote to the Ministry of Agriculture, as it was then, and said, I've got a student, she's got a good degree, would you like to fund a PhD? And they did. So that's how I ended up doing a PhD. Yeah.
And did you come straight to Bristol from your PhD, or did you do a postdoc?
Yeah, no. I was still writing up. So while I was standing terrified in front of a class of vet students, I was going home in the evenings and writing up my PhD. I hadn't written it up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's what I mean about them being desperate in taking me on.
I think I hope to see if I can catch up with John Webster on one of these, but I shouldn't think John had a moment's doubt in it all.
Oh, he was nice. I also had I had a bit of help with the interview. So this is another nice story. You'll just have to shut me up, Daniel.
No, this is what this is all about. I want to hear these stories that I've heard before.
Okay, so here's a nice one. So when I heard that I'd got an interview at Bristol, everyone in the zoology department, because it was a lovely supportive group, the animal behaviour group, they were all very excited. They're like, oh, Christine's got an interview, that's great. And so they said, would you like a practice interview? So I said, oh yeah, that'd be amazingly helpful. So I had a practice interview, and Richard Dawkins was one of the people doing my practice interview. So Richard Dawkins asked me, he said, I was busy doing all sorts of research on veterinary stuff and details of my own experiments, thinking that he'd be asking this very, very precise stuff in the interview. And I walked into this practice and Richard Dawkins said, Christine, how would you define animal welfare? And I was absolutely flummoxed. I couldn't think. It was so complex. How could you define it? And I mumbled and I got in a terrible mess about it and made a complete mess of it. And I thought, oh, I really need to have a little definition ready. I got to the Bristol interview and Professor John Bourne looked at me and he said, Christine, how would you define animal welfare?
So how would you define
And of course, this time I was ready. So just something really simple. So animal welfare is a concept that encompasses both the physical and the mental well-being of an animal. That was it. Didn't matter what you said, you just had to be able to say something. Yeah. And that's what I said. So, but I got it very wrong with Richard Dawkins. So I owe Richard Dawkins and Marion Dawkins.
There we go. Oh, wow. That's quite, so make sure you prepare.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm terrible at. Like this talk, this chat today, I should have first prepared more. But anyway, so you arrive at Bristol.
Yep.
You've done a bit of chicken work. What was it like arriving at that time? Sort of, because you were a lecturer in animal welfare, and Don was saying, it's interesting you're saying, because your experience about being in the vet school and sort of trying to all these vets. Don said exactly the same when he first moved to Cambridge. He said, I knew nothing about sort of being a vet, but I just went around chatting to people to find out what they did that was veterinary related.
Yeah, so similar, I think. I do remember somebody saying to me that, did I really think this was all a bit of a fad or a fashion and it would all sort of die down again? And of course, I didn't think that. I thought, no, animal welfare is really important and, I think it's going to grow. But I think it was just becoming a little bit fashionable and people were talking about it. I think vets in particular wondered whether it was something that would go away again. So I remember that. Mostly at Bristol, I remember very clearly that it was still structured as these three very different departments. So there was surgery and vet medicine and then animal husbandry. And the animal husbandry and vet medicine people met for coffee. We didn't see so much of the surgeons, but we'd meet for coffee. And so I ended up learning quite a lot about things like epidemiology in particular from people like Peter Cripps and Kenton Morgan, and later Laura Green, Nigel French. I was very interested in that, in epidemiology and sort of quantitative methods.
Yeah, and
so that was good. And then
I was going to say, a lot of your early papers sort of, very much tapped into epidemiology and animal welfare, which was quite a different, which again, just thinking about, the chat, trying to bring the science into animal welfare. So it wasn't just fluffy, we're imagining what the animals are feeling, but these are the issues. Yeah. And you could focus on the physical issues, like, you're not going to argue that this animal that's lame is not suffering. So let's look at the...
Exactly.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Keep going.
Yeah. No, exactly. So, and that was great because I learned a lot about sort of statistics and epidemiology and all that. And I think particularly the work that I did with Laura Green was very, you know, just fantastic. The work that we did on feather pecking and tail biting in pigs. It was.
Oh no, I've lost you.
I think it may have been.
Hang on, I've lost you for a second. So I've lost you for a second.
Oh, okay.
So I think your satellite just dropped out. We said that might happen.
Yeah.
You were just saying the work you did with Laura Green. If you could
Laura, yeah. Okay, so I just want to say that, you know, Laura was inspirational, really. I enjoyed working with her hugely, and it wasn't that the statistics was any different, but it was the first time that that people had thought about using a behaviour outcome, certainly in the animal or veterinary field. So we looked at feather pecking as an outcome. What are the risk factors? Or tail biting in pigs, vulva biting in sows, a lot of different studies where all we did was, instead of a disease, we slotted in a behaviour type outcome. And it was great. That worked really well. And then in the animal husbandry department, there was Christopher Wathers, and he was working on engineering and housing and air quality for animals, heating and lighting. But we went on a sort of student field trip together, and on the coach journey there and the coach journey back, I was telling him about preference testing, and he was fascinated by preference testing as a concept, getting the animal to tell you what it wanted. And he went on, of course, to Silso and built fantastic equipment where he was able to do, you know, and his students do some really high quality sort of preference testing for animals, light, heat, gases that they found aversive or attractive. So he was able to scale it up and bring his engineering background to that. So that was another, you know, a lot of these things are just amazing coincidences and happy synergies that take place. Yeah.
It is, yeah, as you say, having the multidisciplinary element where you've got people with different skills coming together and people seeing that it seems amazing to hear you say that, to think that, you know, people didn't seem to have thought of the idea of using a behavioral or welfare outcome in epidemiology. It's just, you know, you just think.
I mean, I might be wrong. And so, you know, if anybody wants to, they can sort of go and check. But in my mind, and I'm probably biased, in my mind, I think that's true. I think that the sort of paper that we did on feather pecking, you know, for me, it was like a light bulb, epidemiology. And for Laura, it was, behaviour outcome, and sort of stuck them together. So,
and then the work you did with Paul McGreevy was very epidemiological with the horses. And that, you know, that is a seminal piece of work. And I remember you telling me once that, because was it the Horse Race Betting Levy Board that sponsored that, and they I think somebody
they did sponsor a little bit of it,
because I seem to recall you telling me that they asked you the question, was there a behaviour journal that you might be able to publish in? And you just thought, they're all higher impact than any of the veterinary journals.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was funny.
But it's interesting because, you know, in the public's mind, and you know, a lot of people equate vets as sources of information on animal welfare, but the first two major appointments are both to non-vets in vet schools, which I think is interesting. But I also recall when I was at Bristol, you know, welfare was also perhaps the number one, or one of the highest reasons for terrorism, because the
animal rights.
The animal rights. I did say, I shouldn't call them welfare because it is animal rights, but I remember, you know, one of the physiology lecturers had a bomb put under his car.
Max Headley.
Max. He was working on painting cats, but Bristol led the way in developing analgesia for cats later on. So, but it was, I mean, did you ever feel threatened because of your work? You know, people say, well, you're working with chickens in cages and whatever, and although you're trying to improve the welfare of them, and you know, ultimately your work was seminal, I think, to the bans in the EU. So, you know, that people would not understand where you were coming from. Did
I ever feel threatened? I never felt it viscerally. I felt it logically. We were told, there was a brief period where we were actually issued with mirrors to look for bombs under cars. And I remember actually doing that for a short period of time. But I did it because I'd been told to do it. I didn't feel threatened. But I think I do not approve of violence, you know, with my Quaker background and my citizen's hat and my humanity. I don't think violence is the route to solve any problem whatsoever. I think it's absolutely appalling, and I completely condemn it. I do think though, that there's an interesting question, and I have wondered in recent years, there is a really interesting question about the extent to which being a moderate animal welfare scientist sort of makes you also a collaborator, perhaps, in systems that you just don't approve of. And so that's an interesting tension that I think is something that's come back to as I've got older, and now as I wonder about retiring at some point. It's a question that I've been thinking about a lot, about whether there are some things that you can improve, and that's great, but whether there are some things that you shouldn't go near because actually they shouldn't happen, and any improvement will be so minor that it's
Okay. So there's a couple of things there, and I'll try and my mind is terrible these days, but I mean, the first point about being involved, that's the really interesting one, because as you know, we've been doing work on shock collars, and we did get, you know, and one of the reasons why, you know, we collaborated with Bristol and we put Jonathan in as the lead. We mentioned Jonathan Cooper earlier, and you know, Jonathan has a really good mind.
Absolutely.
And you know, we said, well, Jonathan, you know, you're outside of the dog world, you know, so people like Emily Blackwell and Rachel Casey and John Bradshaw and myself were quite clearly identifiable as doggy people. You're not, and you've come from the field of working with battery cages, so you're used to handling these sorts of controversies. So you, in a way, you're an ideal figurehead, and that was one of the reasons why sort of we grouped around Jonathan to do that. And you know, when we first got the award, we did get we got attacked by both sides, but yeah, the welfare people saying you shouldn't be doing this research, and we said, well, it's legal. And, you know, we need the science in order to move things on. And it's interesting that now that it looks like legislation might be coming in England with the government under the new sentience, the pro-collar people have really, I mean, they've employed these lobbyists to really have a go at not just the research, but at Jonathan and me as well, as individuals. And you know, the people that we've involved in it who are not as sort of long in the tooth as us, you know, we've reassured them, don't worry about this, you know, you're doing fine. But it's an interesting dilemma, because as I said, if it is legal, and you know, it's much better that we answer a debate you know, with some science than just try to argue, and as logical as the argument might be, you know, but actually having some data is important.
So I think that's right. Oh, and first of all, I also want to, if I gave any impression that Jonathan was anything other than a brilliant scientist, I want to retract that, because I also have the highest respect for Jonathan as a scientist.
He's published in Nature.
He was, I know, and he was a fantastic student, actually. He did a brilliant PhD on sort of stereotypies in voles, and I've enjoyed having many conversations with him in the years since. So I just want to get that on the record.
The other thing I should say about Jonathan as well, you know, just as I said, we can have a lot of. He's a very he cares a lot about people as well. You know, he spends an inordinate amount of time looking after students and whatever, and other individuals as colleagues, and I've been the recipient of that as well. So but yeah, no, so I don't think we did. Anyway.
Good. So I can see why he would be a great person to sort of front that project, but I think it's horrible to hear that there's sort of any personal criticism involved by wherever it comes from. I do wonder now, I think it must be so much harder in some ways for people starting out now in this field, where there's social media and all that sort of thing, and where people can anonymously post things. I think I would have found that incredibly difficult to deal with when I was younger, and now I have pretty much zero social media profile, so I don't have to think about it. But I think that it was bad enough trying to start out in science and deal with normal constructive criticism, but to deal with unthinking sort of verbal abuse, I think would be really, really difficult. But the central dilemma, if we go back to that, so the example that you've given about dogs with shock collars, you've got a very specific question there that does need science. I mean, I do think the scientific method is a great method for answering those questions. I suppose where I feel it's more difficult would be, you know, research into, well, say I don't think it's right to kill or eat cows, then research into slightly better methods of killing cows, for me, might not be the right thing to do. For somebody who thinks essentially that's okay, then go ahead and do it. But I suppose I've just got to the age where I'm starting to question what the really fundamental things are.
So can I ask you a question then?
Yeah.
Okay, and you know me well enough, so I hope you won't be offended by this.
Yeah, no.
So this was something that I did think about, and I can't remember whether I thought about it as a student or after I was a student, but this enriched cages for chickens. Yeah. And, you know, the thought that I had, and I should declare the fact I am not vegan. I'm not even vegetarian, except, well, but I have been vegetarian at one point. But to me, the sort of, the central dilemma was, well, you're talking about enriched cages and giving dust bathing to these chickens. I don't think I've ever asked you this question, but to me, it was just sort of, well, if you're living a really, really crap life, just making a little bit less crap isn't really actually that good. So why are we bothering with that? Is that?
Yeah. No, that's exactly the sort of dilemma. So that's exactly as I get towards the end of my career and I look back, that I could say, was that right or was that wrong? So at the time, it seemed to be the only way to get any shift at all, because the alternative of going, okay, everything cage free was so beyond the experience of the industry at that time. Everything was automated, the cages were automated, that it was just going to meet with massive resistance. And so it was that question, okay, well, let's nudge, let's make things a little bit better. And I suppose I did, you know, again, going from the scientific evidence, I did genuinely think it was better, that it was better that a chicken could stretch its wings. It was like going into a sort of premium seat on an aircraft instead of economy class. So you don't want to be on the aircraft. You don't want to be on the aircraft at all. But if you're in economy and you can hardly move, it's utterly grim. Whereas if you're in premium, you know, at least you could stretch out. So it was this tiny, I agree with you, it's a tiny incremental improvement. But what's really interesting to see is that I think that everything's going to go cage free in Europe very soon, and the United States and probably other countries too.
Wow.
But it's because the technology's improved, so the cage free systems now work really well. And people have learned a bit more about how to manage these very large groups with problems like feather pecking and cannibalism that were quite prohibitive to cage-free systems are less of a problem now due to both the bird genetics and the management. But certainly the public have continued to see cages as cages, and the enriched cage in my mind was never the final answer.
So again, I just want to keep going on this, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to what extent do you think that if you have a chicken and it's shoved into a cage at a certain age and it's not an enriched cage, how much that suffers compared to a chicken that goes into a cage where it can sometimes do things that are quite nice? And I just sort of, do you know where I'm going with this question? Is it better to not, the experience of having had a better time? I think there's an ethical issue that, keeping an animal so that it never does anything that it may want to do. But if they don't have a concept of a better life, because they don't have the experience, then are they going to suffer more in a way in an enriched cage potentially, because there's going to be competition for that dust bath with 3 or 4 other chickens in a cage, than the one that is in the unenriched cage and actually in effect is brain damaged by the whole thing, and maybe it shuts down,
Well, I mean, you're talking there about the sort of some of the behaviors, particularly where the behavior is governed by being able to see or perceive different stimuli. So seeing something is motivating you to do it, so you may get extra frustrated if you can't. But beyond that, in those very small battery cages, I think it's almost impossible to sort of imagine them now, since they're gone. There's such physical constraint, that the birds couldn't move. And I think there was a physical pain element to it, that they actually couldn't stretch their wings. And that's got nothing to do with a sort of external perception. I think that there was a sort of physical need to be able to move your limbs, going right back to the original 5 freedoms, freedom to stand up, turn around, and not being able to just even move your body, or to have to climb over another chicken to get to the food. I think there was a sort of physical pain element involved in that. And so moving to the enriched cage got rid of that, because the birds could at least move enough to just do those basic movements, turn around, preen their own plumage, for example. Then I think you're right that you get to a really thorny issue in animal welfare, which is the extent to which you can sort of keep an animal that you're managing, the extent to which you can keep it happy by providing stuff for it. And just giving an animal a few things and it's saying, its welfare is going up to this level, may not be true, because animals form expectations. And then once those expectations are met, they maybe get frustrated because they want a little bit more. And it's the idea of, can you be happy if you've never been sad? So can you keep animals at this constant state? Or in fact, do they need a bit more freedom to experience, difficult times, as well as the sort of calm environment that you've provided for them?
So a few years ago, before COVID, I was at a conference with Rob Young, and he gave a talk, and he was sort of saying, well, his view now is you have to look at, is it a life worth living? Which I think actually is a really nice perspective on it.
Yeah.
There will be crappy times. And as long as you're not inflicting those for a prolonged period, and the animal has no concept that it's ever going to end, which makes it intolerable, then it's okay that bad things happen, because bad things happen and we adapt to it from that perspective. But I think sort of looking at the life worth living, as opposed to just it always struck me as strange that trying to avoid the 5 freedoms was avoiding everything. And I'm thinking, shit happens, to put no finer point on it. What's important is you can cope with it when it does happen. And
I agree. And I think again, I'd go back to sort of Martha Kiley Worthington, who was one of my earliest sort of mentors, and she would also, I think, see things in that way, that animals should be able to live a full life, reach their potential. Yes, they're going to experience some hard times. The weather might be cold and freezing one night, or there might be something frightening has happened. But if they are able to cope with it and also have very positive experiences, that overall, a life worth living. And I think that's a great way to look at it.
So you say about sort of fulfilling their potential, and Martha Kiley Worthington, who again, fascinating character and a great thinker who thinks outside the box. But I've recently reviewed a paper, and because it's in Frontiers, my name's there as a reviewer, so they'll know. And they were arguing a similar case about cognitive enrichment for dogs. And in the review, I said to them, well, you know, just because dogs can be shown to have these cognitive abilities, that doesn't mean that every dog, I wouldn't think necessarily needs to do it. So to me, you know, some of these dogs, you know, like Rico with the fantastic linguistic ability. Now, it might be that all dogs have that. But one of the things we do know is the dogs with the linguistic abilities were all brought up in environments where people were just chatting to them the whole time. Now, they all happen to be border collies. Whether or not there is a genetic element, or to what extent there is a genetic element that is breed related, but it is that immersive experience. And I just think that, you know, the brain adapts a lot to the environment it's presented with. And therefore, this idea that, well, you should be able to fulfill your potential, I'm not sure, because I think, you know, there are potential.
Okay.
There's so much latent potential in all of us, you know.
Okay. I've probably, but, there's probably many areas where I've not fulfilled my potential. But okay, so maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it. But I think there are some better. That's my dog again. Hey, maybe someone coming home. That there are, maybe they don't need to fulfill that, like a show jumping horse probably doesn't need to, you know, most horses don't need to become show jumpers. In fact, you could argue no horse needs to become a show jumper or tell us the absolute maximum height it could ever jump. So maybe I don't mean potential in that way, but I do mean the potential to have some social relationships, the potential to make choices, the potential to explore the world. I think it's more about choice. So I think that's the essential thing for me, is that animals have choices, that they're able to
and some autonomy in those choices.
Yes. I guess that's right.
It's difficult to know where to draw the line, I guess. Are you all right with your dog?
I think I've got some people coming home right now, so there may be some other noise off camera, but
that's fine. So you mentioned earlier about sort of, it is, I think you're quite right. It's probably a lot harder for people starting out now with social media, where anyone can take a swipe at you. And, you know, and there's a wonderful book by, I've forgotten what his first name is, but the surname's Garvey, called The Persuaders. It's a brilliant book, and it's about how we've moved from using argument to get to the truth to winning the argument being a goal in itself, and the dangers of that. And the first chapter actually of the book is it's about sort of the old debating houses, and it talks about the idea that you'd have two people debating because they'd start off with different points of view, but one of them might concede and say, actually I hadn't thought about that, and therefore we think we've got to the truth. The second chapter is about the first Iraq war and the fact that America was deciding whether or not they would go to war, and then there were these stories of the Iraqi troops going in and destroying ventilators and incubation units in the maternity ward, and sort of he said, well, we can't stand by and let this happen. And he explains the story that the sort of Congress, there was this person who would give evidence to Congress just before they voted on it, on the understanding that she could maintain her anonymity, ostensibly because she was worried about her family back in Iraq. And she gave apparently an eyewitness account of this going on. And America passed the decision to go into the first Iraq war by 4 votes, I think it was, partly as a result of that testimony. And George Bush made reference to this being quite important in swaying him personally. Many years later, it emerges that actually it was all set up by a PR firm, and the person giving evidence was a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. and they just wanted the Americans to get in. And that's where we've gone from, debate being focused on the truth to winning the argument. And this is, as you say, in the modern media age, this is the difficulty that we've got. But anyway, that was just me having that rant, which is, I mean, it is, and it's really quite stark because those two chapters are next to each other. It's well worth a read for anyone thinking about it. And as I said, the stuff we've been doing on shock collars, they've employed a media firm who, to just push and use every button and trick in the book in order to try and win the argument. That's that's damaging to science, and it's difficult because the advice I get from the universities: don't engage with these people. They want to set up a forum in order to bring you down. So I've had recently a number of invites for people to say, oh, will you do a podcast with me? And these are people from that side. Or one of them said, oh, would I do a live debate with them? No, I'm not going to do a live debate because that's not going to get us to the truth. Now, I might do a podcast with somebody, we'll see, because at the same time, I think it is important that we can have a constructive discussion rather than just try and win the debate. But anyway, although you said you sort of the media, you have done, as I said, a number of things for public dissemination of science. As I said, there was a stimulus response and let's ask the animals. And those things, they went into, I looked it up actually after the conversation with Don, because we happened to mention it. More than half of UK schools took those videos. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, and that was because the person who was involved with it was Audrey Iton. And Audrey Iton was a nutritionist and author, and she wrote a book called The F Plan Diet, which meant fiber, the fiber plan diet, I think in the 1980s. And that was an absolute bestseller. So she made a lot of money from that book, but she always had a sort of passion for animal welfare herself, and she wanted to put some of that money back into the animal welfare field, particularly farm animals, or almost exclusively she was interested in farm animals. She felt that other people saw them as meat on legs, that's her phrase, and she wanted them to see them as individuals. So she had this really clear vision of what she wanted to do. And she was also really astute and canny. And she said, what we need to do is we need to pitch this in a way that it will be relevant to the national curriculum. And so we had lots of discussions, and we looked at the national curriculum for children. And to be honest, there was not much animal behaviour in the national curriculum. The only bit of animal behaviour that is really there is about learning. So it's about this idea of a stimulus that an animal responds to, or you touch a hot plate and you take your hand off, and then you can have a more conditioned response with some learning intervening. And that was about it for animal behaviour in the national curriculum. But she said, well, if that's all that's in there, that's the format for these programmes. But every example has to be a farm animal. And so she came up with that. And then I came up with most of the actual animal examples. And we then went ahead and filmed it, and we'd endless hours. She'd come down to Bristol and we'd sit late at night. She'd check into her little bed and breakfast, and we'd sit up going through the script. She'd write a script, and then I'd be like, oh, you can't say that, and we'd alter it. And
it's interesting. But that's amazing, somebody to have that vision. And as you say, and it's funny because one of the deputy vice chancellors at Lincoln, she's a vet, Liz Mossop. She was at Nottingham Vet School, and I was chatting to her because, again, partly because of some of this stuff that is going on, and particularly the companion animal field is quite an emotive subject as well. I think. I'm not saying farm animals aren't as well, but I think it engages a certain section of the population. And I was saying to her, I just think that what we're not teaching students very well, in my opinion, in this country, and I suspect in many other countries, is what the scientific method is. People, and it's actually something that you could teach in primary school. And because Liz is a sort of specialist in learning and pedagogy, that's why I said to her, and said, look, do you think this is something we could start to think about? And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
I probably need to retire to do this. But again, looking at the national curriculum at each level and just teaching, you know, in the earlier stages, just to have curious minds, because again, you know, we mentioned earlier about our education, you know, and education is still stuck on this model of being captains of industry and, you know, just pumping you full of facts. Well, Google gives us the information. We want people to actually think and be creative. And, you know, my youngest son, Thomas, he's very smart, but he came close to dropping through the cracks at school because he's more imaginative. Stefan, you know, you could ask Stefan to do anything and, you know, he'd learn hieroglyphics in half an hour if you just gave him a book to do it, because that's the way that he works. Thomas would say, why do you want me to do this? You know, and because of that, he really struggled at times at school. And eventually, you know, he's done really well. And he said he's off to university later this month, next month. Not quite in September, are we? But you could just see how kids with curious minds, and, you know, he did psychology, digital photography, and history at A levels. And I just thought that was brilliant, because he learned a bit about the scientific method. He learned about the importance of history and investigating, and the digital skills. You know, he's the one who in the past has edited all these podcasts, which is why the recent ones aren't so good, because I'm doing it myself. And you think they're the skills that we want, but that's not what the way our education is set up for. So, you know.
You're right. So science in school is often presented as fact. You know, here's some scientific facts to learn, and here's some great technology, and here's some exciting explosions. But the idea of science being about asking questions, and that being neutral, so that you're not pinning all your hopes on your hypothesis. You're almost, you know, you're just as ready to see your hypothesis succeed or fail. That element of it isn't taught.
In fact, and I know you said you didn't like social media, but I think it was today or yesterday, something came up on my Facebook feed. And it was this educationist saying, well, first of all, we don't really know much about how humans learn in school, you know, efficiently. But he said, the big problem is that people say, you've got to learn to read because that will get you a good job. And first of all, we're making education, he said, using his words, very capitalistic. It's all about getting a job. And, you know, actually to a young kid, learning to read so you can get a good job don't really connect. To say, learn to read so you can escape into these imaginary worlds, and you know, that will get a kid reading, you know. And with the way we're framing it all, it seems to all be wrong as well. You know, and I think that's but I don't know, do you think there are more opportunities to do that sort of stimulus response stuff into the national curriculum, and perhaps as academics we should be doing more of that, because it's a long time since, you know,
it is a long time. I'm not even sure what is in the national curriculum now. I've lost track, really.
Because they were VHS.
It would be great.
And I felt them many
they were.
I think
they are available online now. I think they've been uploaded onto YouTube and things. But they are quite outdated, and there would be many brilliant examples from both animal cognition, animal learning theory, sensory perception. I mean, actually, they were made at a time when we didn't even know that much. So the range of examples now that could go into something would be fantastic. And also, I think you should apply for funding, Daniel. I think you should get some funding and do it.
Tell me who's going to fund it, unless you find somebody with or maybe the Atkins diet lady, whoever that was. You know, find somebody. But sometimes it does take that sort of thing. But the other thing I mentioned in the introduction was this Radio 4 program you did called "Would You Eat an Egg?" I think is a great title as well. And again, to me that was a real stroke of genius. And if anybody listening, if you haven't heard it, then find it on through whatever means. As I said, if in the UK, I know you can still access it through the BBC Sounds, or just Google "Would You Eat an Alien?" and you'll find it. I'm sure there's probably versions on YouTube or whatever. how did you come up with that idea? Do you want to explain a little bit about the premise behind it? It's probably better.
I came up with that. I came up with that idea because I've always, when I've had pets myself, I've always looked at them and just wondered what is going on in their heads. And then I was giving a lecture on animal cognition, one of the very first lectures on animal cognition. And I put up a picture of my dog at the time. And I said, we know a lot now about the physical aspects of this dog, but what's actually going on in his mind? What is it like to be this dog? I said, we probably know as much about that as we know about an alien life form. But if we went to another planet and met an alien, my goodness, we'd be much more, resources would be plunged into it. Would be, how can we communicate with these aliens? How are they living? What are their social norms? Do they have rules? Or are they utterly primitive? How would we interact with them? All the Star Trek stuff, if we made contact with a life form anywhere else, NASA and all sorts of resources around the world would be poured into exploring this alien mind. And I said, and yet we have these aliens living in our houses with us, and we're not really exploring what they're thinking or what they're doing. So that was the way that I first sort of introduced it, or brought aliens and animals together. And I think that Julian Hector, who was the sort of director of the Natural History Unit at Bristol, I think I mentioned something like that to him many years ago, but it stuck in his mind. And he came back to me maybe 15 years after I'd said that to him. And he said, I've never forgotten that thing about aliens. He said, we need to make a program. Do you think we could do something on animal ethics around, alien ethics and animal ethics? And I said, yeah, I've just been waiting to do it. So that's how it came about. And then it's very much about ethical issues. And the advantage of it is that it takes all the heat out of the argument, because instead of directly,
exactly. I think that's one of the real genius of it. It just puts it into a different context that makes you think, but then makes you reflect and, how does that apply to the world that I live in,
Yeah, exactly. You're not saying to someone, should you have a turkey for Christmas? You're just not saying that. No. You've got this sort of conceit that you've got this human spaceman stranded on an island. He wants to eat something. He's got his little rule book that says he, like Star Trek, do not harm the creatures you meet. So he's got that in his pocket. And what a good maxim to live by, do not harm the creatures you meet. So there he is, he's met all these different creatures, but he's getting hungry. He's got to eat one of them or he's going to starve. I mean, it's ridiculous, obviously, but there you go. So now he's trying to work out which one can I eat without harming it. And so then you go through, program 1 is about sentience, program 2 is about humane killing, program 3 takes you into welfare a little bit, and maybe social connections. I think that's important. It's the idea, I'm going to be humanely kill this alien, everything's going to be fine. And you're like, but what about its friends? They're going to miss it.
And he's getting bonded to one of them as well. He's thinking,
then he gets bonded to one. So you get this dilemma that he's, that it would cause more harm to these social ones, but they're not that attractive. And there's this little cute one that he's really become very bonded to. So you get this horrible dilemma at the end. And the final episode is more about personhood. So are there some aliens that are complex enough that even if you could kill them humanely, it would still be wrong to do so because they have lives that they appreciate and lives that they want to go forward, just as it would be wrong to kill a human. So you get into that personhood argument. But I'll tell you something, at the very end, Jake Yap, who is the spaceman and the comedian, we left it to him to make the decision with that dilemma. And I didn't know till the final decision that he made, which way he would go. And around the radio studio, there was such, no, he couldn't have done that. There were sort of definitely two tribes because it was very, very finely balanced dilemma.
Won't say what which one he goes for in case people want to listen to it.
No, I won't give. I'm not going to give it that way.
He's a committed vegan.
He is
as well,
a committed vegan.
So he made the decision of taking part in it, knowing he didn't have to kill his fiction.
Well, as he says, he's a committed vegan, but he wasn't going to sacrifice his own life. He was definitely still going to eat something in this scenario where there was no alternative. So, but yeah, I won't say what he chose.
But I mean, in a way, I'm surprised there hasn't been more of that sort of program as well, because it is such a great way of communicating, and it's that mass engagement. Yeah, as I said, but I don't know, maybe because it takes hard thought to think of a brilliant idea.
Well, there was another program, which was a television program that was on for a while, that explored a sort of parallel universe where vegans had sort of taken over the world. I don't know if you saw it. It was a comedy.
Yes,
it was very funny.
Yes, it is, because it's sort of set in the future, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the future, and they're saying their grandparents ate meat, and they're shamed because they're descendants of people who ate meat. Yeah, I did see that one.
They had to go to a sort of therapy support group to talk about the fact that they'd eaten cheese or something, and it was actually really quite funny. It was very funny. It was very, it was sort of in a way mocking sort of veganism in some way, but it was also bringing in some really complex animal ethics arguments in a light-hearted way. So that is another example where comedy has been used to explore animal ethics.
To look that up afterwards and put the link in. I can't remember what it was, but if one of us remembers, when we can do it. But
was it Simon somebody? Was it Simon someone?
Ooh,
I might be making that up.
Not sure.
Yeah.
But I do remember it.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's talk about horses, your other great passion other than chickens, and whatever. And obviously you had, Paul have you supervised any other horse PhDs other than Paul and Claire? You must have done.
Yeah, Becky Hothershall.
Oh yeah.
Becky Hothershall did a nice PhD on learning, diet and learning in foals. So so that was a big one. And Sarah Giles, Sarah, I have to remember. Sarah Giles did a PhD. It wasn't so much on behaviour, but she looked a lot at obesity and risk factors for obesity in ponies and horses, and that was another PhD on equine PhD. Yeah. And
you've got some at the RVC now. Have you got somebody working?
Yeah, two. I've got Freddie Dorr, who's doing a PhD looking at behavioural correlates of chronic disease, so sweet itch in particular. So my husband Doug has been working on sweet itch recently, particularly an oral immune therapy, which hopefully will work to reduce the symptoms. But we were looking at what the behavioural correlates of sweet itch was, going back to this idea of quality of life and lives worth living. Some of these horses that have these skin allergies have huge inflammation, and it's really lowers their quality of life. So we've been looking a bit at the sort of behavior and how the oral immune treatment or proposed oral immune treatment might help. So it's a different measure of disease, I suppose. So Freddie's looking at that. And then there's another student called Aline Bouquet. She's working with the National Stud at the moment, doing a longitudinal study of foals, and particularly looking at things like the CCTV footage that you get when the foal is born. So you've actually got this fantastic resource. All the studs are monitoring the mares with the CCTV, but you then are able to look at that very early period. How much attention did the mare pay to the foal? How much human interference was there? How long did it take the foal before it stood up, before it suckled? So she's looking at this very, very early period, and then looking at how that, how it influences future development. Yeah.
Of course, that's Amanda Waters, who was also your student as well, wasn't she? And it's
Amanda,
sort of the earlier stages of that, where she looked at the longitudinal development of the repetitive. But so let's just talk about, because people, I think anybody interested in horses will have heard of Paul McGreevy, and I have asked Paul to do one of these, but he's changed.
I hope he does.
He has agreed. He's changed universities, and he's still getting sorted into his new one.
Good.
So but Claire, who we've co-supervised, just
Yeah.
say a little bit about her research. So she's looked at this sort of social buffering effect, and I think it's really neat, the results that she got. That and you know, what Claire was interested in is what is the role of another horse in reducing the stress of a companion. And this, what she seems to have found is this difference between the physiological adaptation and the behavioral adaptation. So if there's something really scary, then actually the presence of another horse is not going to make much of a difference, because you just get out of the situation. But the presence of the horse might help the physiological recovery. And then if it's something that's more gradual, that's less certain, then looking at the reaction of the other horse might be quite important in shaping that. And again, it's one of those things which, once the data come in and you see it and you think, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But it just seems to have, again, been completely missed in the literature, as far as we can tell.
And I think one of the really nice things that, in some ways sort of took me a bit by surprise was that Claire did, she did a fantastic experiment in the first year. She went and worked in France and got this result that you've just mentioned. She went back the next year and essentially replicated the study. The only thing that was really different was whether the companion horses were familiar or not, and got the same result.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it.
I mean, how often do you get that sort of replication? That's such a strength.
And that's a good point. I know in the paper we mentioned about the replicability, but you're quite right. There is this sort of lack of replication of research in the literature, and that's what science is meant to be able to do. So to be able to do it, I think was really important. So,
and I think, as horse owners, I think we know that social contact is important, but we're not sure about the nuances. So which does it matter which horse is a companion? If you've got a horse that's anxious in a stable, is any horse next door to it going to help that anxiety, or does it have to be a particular bonded companion or a familiar one or not? And these are really practical questions. So I think Claire's PhD is great because it can start to provide some answers that can lead to some very, very practical solutions about horse management. And I think all horse owners are interested in reducing, well, I maybe speak personally, but in reducing unwanted reactivity.
So I mean, that brings me on to the sort of another area that I know that whether you're still working on it or not, which is empathy, and that communication with it. And this is something which, again, I know I've been thinking about for a while, not doing anything really about it, but to me, sort of, the empathy, this cognitive versus the emotional empathy. And I'm not, the more work I do on animal cognition, the more I'm starting to question whether or not animals are following fairly simple rules. And they're very observant, whatever. But, and I wonder in the case of, with humans, because we've got language, we reflect on things and we complicate our suffering as a result. And how much of the what we think might be a cognitive ability, it's that debating cognition of how much of cognition is in the brain and how much of it is in the senses. I think that having that sensory ability to be able to detect those things, and as you say, we can't begin to think how they actually represent it. But when it comes to empathy in animals, because you have done some work, haven't you, on the chickens with the empathy, the mothers stepping in. And do you want to say a little bit about the findings there before we go on, just for the benefit of anyone this?
Yeah, so gosh, if I can try and explain it fairly quickly and not too complicated a manner, it came from some work that we did on social learning in chickens. So I'm going to just briefly mention that first, because that's actually quite important. So what we did was we had broody hens that had chicks, and the chicks were divided into two groups. They lived with the hen, but they were fed separately. So the hen was taught that one food colour was perfectly okay to eat. So she might be taught, for example, that red food is good, but yellow food is bitter. And half of her chicks were given the same information out of sight of her. The other half of her chicks were given the opposite information. So they thought that yellow was tasty and red was bitter. And all we did was we then let the hen watch either the first group of chicks that were doing what they should do, according to the hen, and then we let her watch the group of chicks that seemed to be doing completely the opposite of what was right. And what we saw was that the hens watching the chicks make apparent mistakes, because the chicks weren't making mistakes, they were doing what was perfectly okay. So that was a great way of separating it out. So it was only the hen's knowledge of what the chicks should be doing that differed. When the hens watched the chicks making apparent mistakes, they became more agitated. So they just did their sort of food demonstrating display at a higher rate. They called more, they scratched more, they pecked more, they dropped food more. And we thought, again, years later, we went back to it and we did a similar experiment, but this time the chicks got air puffs, or they went into a room where a certain colour room suggested they might get an air puff, and the other colour room suggested they were safe. So we did the same experiment, but with a different context. This time, we also had better technology, so we were able to measure the heart rate of the hens and the temperature of the hens and that sort of thing. But again, what we were able to do with this design is separate out what's a direct response to the chicks, because the chicks are doing the same thing in both conditions, from what's the hen's cognitive perception of what might happen to the chicks. So this time, when the hen sees the chicks in the safe environment, quite calm. When she sees the chicks in the dangerous environment, again, then you start to see this physiological reaction. So the heart rate, temperature, eye temperature changes going on. But she's not responding to the chicks because both groups of chicks are in a safe environment. You know, they're behaving in the same way. So it's her interpretation of what's going on. So that is a physiological reaction. It's not a physiological matching, or not much of a physiological matching going on. There is a complication, but I'm not going to go into that in this. It's too complicated. There's not very much physiological matching going on. There is a little bit, but there's not very much. They are slightly more agitated if their chicks are more agitated. But primarily it's a cognitive perception. Oh, those groups of chicks are in apparent danger. If I call, hopefully they'll come away from danger. But what I don't think we have shown or attempted to show is whether the hens have any understanding or theory of mind empathy. I think that would be a step beyond. In no way am I suggesting that the hens are putting themselves into the position of the chicks and thinking, oh, my poor chicks must be feeling frightened. So I think it's, I mean, that could be going on, but there's no reason to assume that it is. You know, being parsimonious, we can explain everything without bringing in theory of mind into this sort of setup. But it does show that they're very that they are taking account of a very complex set of things: the environment, the chick behavior, the potential for risk, and their own previous learnt experience, and they're integrating those things and having a physiological response themselves in accordance to all of that. I don't think it means empathy in the way we think of empathy, that if I empathize with you, I put myself in your shoes and can summon up that feeling of anxiety or headache pain or whatever it is, and then go, oh, poor Daniel, he's had to take some paracetamol. He must have been feeling really a bit ill when we started this interview. So that level of empathy, I don't see in the chickens.
So There was something as you were saying that I was thinking. So yeah, so I'm just wondering, and I haven't thought through the ethics of this, but whether or not if it's possible to do a setup whereby the chicks are put in a risky situation that the mother hasn't had direct experience of, but can make predictions, like, I don't know, thinking walking off the edge of something, you know, that's a little bit more abstract. I just
we haven't done that. We also wondered about trying to do things in a more naturalistic environment as well, because we've only done it in very sort of you know, box, red box, yellow box, hen here, hen, you know, so we've done it in a very, very sort of experimental psychology sort of setup. And I think it would be interesting. So what we haven't really done is we've not let them interact. So we've just looked at the hens separated by perspex from the chicks. And I think it would be interesting to see, well, what happens if the hen can actually interact with the chicks? So if she thinks they're in a dangerous situation, even if they're not, even if they don't think they are, what does she actually do, and does it have an effect? So does she step in to rescue them, or does she go, oh, they're in a dangerous situation, I better get out of here? And I suppose evolutionary sort of theory would determine which was the sensible choice for her to make, but we haven't done that. We're not sure how she would step in and what the effect of that would be.
Maybe there's a new student project there, and you might inspire that student to go into a career in animal behavior, just like you did with me.
Well, that would be great.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time. I'm conscious of the fact that we are running through. So I think we'll probably wrap up now. So thank you once again. As I said, it's been lovely to catch up with you and chat over some of these things. And, you know, you've always been a sounding board for when I remember when I first moved to Lincoln, and sort of arrived here and I was thinking, I've got nobody to talk to. And because I've been in Plymouth before, I would come up and see you in Bristol. You've always been there. So, you know, thank you for all that you've done. And as I said, not just for me, but I'm sure lots of the generations of scientists that you've inspired as well. So thank you very much, and we'll catch up again soon. Okay.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. See you soon. Bye.